My name is Catherine D'Ignazio, and I would like cities to be feminist, healthy, and joyful. So from a gender perspective, cities are facing problems that mainly stem from the fact that we don't think about gender enough. And so one of the main things that I advocate that we can do is really start to center gender as a lens of analysis. And I'm not alone in that regard. There are many folks who are saying that. So we look at different patterns of use between men, women, between non-binary people. How do we use cities in different ways? And then how do we design cities to then support those uses? Most cities are not there. They see gender as being something extra, or they see other things like racial equality as being extra, or accessibility as being extra. Whereas if we actually look at the different people who are included in those different categories, we would actually be talking about the majority of folks who use the city in various ways. And so I think that would be the main thing, is thinking about how do we mainstream a gender-aware approach to the city. So just as we have cities that by default get designed for men, the same thing is happening in our information technologies, in our databases, in our sort of smart mobility solutions. And it's not necessarily that it's a conspiracy. I mean, most men are not like, oh, I want to discriminate against women. But what happens is, because you have a certain group of people controlling, sort of leading the companies, leading the city governments, and so on, we end up designing for those people, right? Because we don't have inclusive leadership at the top. Whereas if we just said, okay, we have a kind of a systematic bias and we need to address it, basically, we would think about how do we make these things more inclusive. And so that's also what we're trying to do with data and databases, is think about how do we look at how gender inequality permeates all those information systems and then address those problems at each stage in the process. For example, women do more trips. More frequently, they are pedestrians or riding public transportation. More frequently, they are doing what Inés Sanchez de Madriaga calls mobilities of care. So they're taking trips to do caring work. And so how would we design a city differently, having those kinds of uses in mind, rather than designing a city that privileges the car, that really thinks about mobility only in kind of like I leave my house and I go to work and then I return home. Like it's like a kind of a stereotypically sort of male way of thinking about the city. And so these would be ways. Also designing cities who can push the strollers. I was just seeing a video how women can't fit their strollers in public bathrooms. So they can't go to the bathrooms in public spaces because they literally can't fit the stroller in there. So I think these kinds of things, so like accessible cities, inclusive cities, all of these are cities that would better support women and thus are feminist cities. And then Barcelona, the city that we're in right now, was just featured by the BBC. A collective from Barcelona was featured in the ways that they're also working to analyze how people are using public spaces. So in particular, kind of differential uses between girls and boys of public playgrounds, and thinking about ways to redesign those to support both of the genders, or really all of the genders, to use those spaces effectively. Because often for example, in the case of the playgrounds, what was happening is that they were finding that large open spaces ended up being used by the boys to play sports, and then the girls ended up getting excluded from those spaces because they would need to compete with the boys. So they found just like kind of dividing a space up into many different, like still having a field for sports, but then dividing the space into other different kind of multiple spaces was a way of then supporting all of the genders to make effective use of the space. One aspiration, I think, would be to really think about how we see better integrated cities in terms of race demographics, in particular in the US context. But then secondly, other aspirations would include cities, again, that support many different bodies. So whether those are bodies of pregnant women, whether those are bodies of breastfeeding women, whether those are bodies of disabled folks, older folks, very young, toddlers. And so thinking about how really if we look at all of those different bodies, which we would say are not the norm, right? Why is our norm not including all of those bodies? And so I would love to see a city that was really taking that level of inclusivity into account, and everything from its design of space to its design of policy to also its design of informational and data-driven spaces and that kind of digital layer that is increasingly kind of living on top of the city.